It took a year, but here we are, 1 year into Donald Trump's second term as president of the United States, and the people of the United States of America do not like what they see. They have issued a stinging rebuke of his presidency. Brand new polling in the New York Times highlights how Donald Trump is so deeply unpopular that he is underwater on nearly every major issue he campaigned on, the things he used to be strong on. 58% of Americans disapprove of Donald Trump's handling of the economy. 64% of all Americans disapprove of Donald Trump's handling of the issue of the cost of living. On the issue of immigration that we have been talking about, it is just as ugly for him. 40% of Americans approve of his handling of the issue, with close to 60% disapproving. And all that leads to this. Just 32% of Americans believe that Donald Trump has made America better since he returned to the presidency. I want to bring into our conversation political analyst and pollster Cornell Felcher. John and Claire are still here. Cornell, what do you see in these numbers?
You know, Nicole, I've been looking at numbers for a long time, and quite frankly, I've never seen anything like it. If you look at how he has completely collapsed among independent voters, and even some of his support, Republicans are getting softer. I mean, you know, it looks like a failed presidency. And I don't say that lightly. When you look at where independent voters are, and quite frankly, the majority of voters are on every major measurement of a presidency, from handling immigration to cost of living, which he's underwater by more than 20 points, to the economy, he's underwater, you know, by large amounts in ways that I've not seen of any presidency in the last 2 decades or more, right? I mean, I don't go back very much, despite the gray hair. I'm actually not that old. But I, you know, whether it be Bush, Clinton, Obama, you know, Daddy Bush, or, I've never seen numbers like this before, right? I don't say it lightly, but this looks like what a failed presidency looks like in the data.
I mean, Cornell, I think what's tricky about it is the bubble that's been erected around him has him coming out and calling affordability a hoax, as John Hallam is saying, you know, doubling and tripling down on the immigration policies, which are wildly unpopular. In a first term, he used to go down to the border, and there is bipartisan support for having a secure border. There is no support for enforcement that looks like militarized streets in American cities. It's just, it doesn't exist. It never has. The idea that he's doubling and tripling down on the things that are wildly unpopular, making him more politically impotent, why do you surmise that's happening?
I have no idea. I mean, it's politics 101. At some point, you should probably do things that the majority of Americans want you to do, as opposed to
like invade Greenland?
Yeah, I mean, there's, you know, we didn't have invade Greenland on our bingo card, right? We didn't have invade Venezuela on our bingo cards. We didn't have Americans being shot in the streets by, you know, mass federal agents either, right? None of these things are what Americans want, and it's what they aspire for. And his calling affordability a hoax, right? So what has he done to tackle the cost of living, right? Which has been in the economy, has been and continues to be the number one issue. What has he done to tackle that very conventional issue of cost of living? Healthcare, and all the data we're seeing, the issue of healthcare costs as people's premiums go up is rising as an issue concern. We're probably going to have another election where healthcare is front and center. What has he done to tackle that issue? What has he what has he done to tackle any of the conventional issues? But then it gets deeper than that, Nicole, because when you look at what Americans are saying about, when you ask them, you know, how do you feel, like they're concerned and they're worried and they're disappointed, right? So there's a spiritual piece to this that is just as important as the conventional piece to it, that Americans feel that the country's heading the wrong direction. And we see more Americans than ever think that the country's more divided than ever, and more Americans than ever thinking that that the American dream is evaporating. So there's a conventional piece of this where he's not tackling the issues that most Americans put at the top of their priority, but there's a deeper spiritual and values issue that Americans look at this presidency and what they're doing and say, this is not America. This does not represent us, which I also think is critically important.
Yeah, that last piece is really hard to get at, both in a poll and in coverage. But if you go out and talk to people, it's all over the place. And the closest I've seen a poll get at it is the number of 71% of Americans who think the country's out of control. That includes, numerically speaking, some people who voted for Donald Trump. Things are getting more and more expensive. He's snatching jets from Middle Eastern countries. He's got 3 wars as very much an option. He said maybe Mexico. He's talking about taking Canada, which invited a rare and historic rebuke from Canada this week. He's backed down in taco fashion, but he hasn't taken his desire for what he said 4 days ago was a, quote, psychological need for ownership of Greenland off the table. I mean, it is a caricature if you look at all of it all the time. But it is, to get to Cornell's point, a feeling that none of it is about the people he represents.
Every day there's something new, but it's never about you.
Right.
It's never about what's going on in your life. It's not about the fact that your car insurance tripled. It's not about the fact that you can't afford the rent anymore. It's not about the fact you have to sell your condo because you can't afford the property insurance. It's not about that you can't get your drugs because everything's not coming out. 40% of America is living paycheck to paycheck. 40%. That's a big number, Nicole. And it's never about that. It's never about you. It's about him. It's about him needing his name on things. It's about him, wanting to build a fancy ballroom, regardless of whether or not he's tearing down part of the historic White House. It's about him wanting to own Greenland. It's about him getting some kind of weird pleasure out of snatching Maduro out of Venezuela, and how that showed somehow he thinks that makes him look powerful.
Well, forget about the operation, but it's saying that, quote, on Venezuela, we run it. The oil is mine.
Yeah, and putting the money in an offshore account. Yeah. Like, how? So, and nobody in America thinks any of that money is coming to them. Nobody in America.
Not.
It's not. No. So I wish people would start polling, are you embarrassed by Donald Trump?
Yeah.
I'd love to know that number, because
if you
I
call
tell you
me,
what,
I'll answer.
I'm embarrassed.
Yes.
I'm embarrassed.
Look, I think people are embarrassed. I think the question that people have, and I think this has always been tricky to cover and to get it in polls, is how do you bring the most people along to the most sensible thing? Taking 5-year-old Liam Conejo Ramos, and then not just taking him, separating him from his father and detaining him in a location that no one in the government is either sharing or certain of. But how does he become collateral damage? How are we at a war against ourselves in America, where a 5-year-old is one of the weapons of Donald Trump's choosing?
How do I get these questions from you?
Because
it's such a like a, it's like.
Because I would ask you if we weren't on TV.
How did we end up in that? How did we come to this?
But look, it's this point about dehumanization, and I feel like we've been talking about that for 10 years.
Yes, we have. And look, I just am going to be a little bit more, because I was thinking about what Cornell was talking about. He kept talking about what has he done, what has he done, what has he done. Those are all really good questions. He hasn't done anything on many of these key issues that voters in general care about, independent voters in particular, a lot of his base. Here's the other thing that we rarely do, is we say, forget about what he's done. What's he going to do? Like, what's going to happen next, right? And I give you a good example. When he went to the Detroit Economic Club last week, he said he was going to talk about housing when he got to Davos, right? And he has some housing proposals, some of which are things that they're not really proposals, but he's like, Elizabeth Warren and he had a conversation recently where he like grabbed onto a few of these kind of populist sounding proposals on the economy, and he says them, and he says, I'm going to come back to them later. Right. So the housing proposals, whatever you think about them, pumping some trivial amount of money into the mortgage market, putting a cap on how many homes large investment firms can get. He's got a bunch of these things that are at least they're a nod.
Which you've now talked about more than he has.
They're a nod towards, I understand that the economy is a political problem for me and my party. But instead, he's been to Davos. How much discussion did he ever lay out any of these policies? No. Did he end up talking about Greenland? Yes. Did he end up trying to blow up the NATO alliance? Yes. But the things that he might do to start to improve his and the Republican Party's political standing all get overshadowed by all the rest of this garbage we're talking about here. And I will just point out, not to be too much of a scientific genius here, but we're in an even-numbered year. Even-numbered years are not like odd-numbered years in politics. He doesn't have 12 months to fix this. He doesn't have 10 months between now and November. He's got till like June.
Yeah.
Because once you get to the summer, Claire will remember what this is like to be on Capitol Hill in the summer of an election year.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody goes home and starts campaigning. And if you don't have the stuff to run on, by the time you get to Memorial Day, maybe say July 4th, you're cooked. You're not gonna change. You're not gonna do things that Congress can run on. The Republicans in Congress can run on in October. In October, you're in full on. He's got a very short runway to do anything to change the trajectory of these numbers. And as of today, there is nothing that looks like they have a plan for. Forget just the most cynical thing. How do I get my numbers up? There's nothing that they have said or done that suggests that they have a 5-month plan to fix the problem, which means that with every day that goes by, the likelihood of Republicans getting decimated in these midterms goes up every single day.
Which makes it even weirder that J.D. Vance was in Minneapolis.
100%.